beginning our third section and a discussion of the health patterns of the contemporary immigrant population. So not surprisingly, some of these same themes surrounding immigrant health from the turn of last century are still around today, although the demographic profile of immigrants has changed dramatically. So like I said earlier, roughly half of the foreign-born are currently from Latin America. And this is a dramatic difference from just 1960 when we look at the composition of the foreign-born population, and 3/4 of the population came from Europe. Okay? So these were immigrants that had arrived in the previous Great Wave, followed by an immigration pause. When we come up to 2008, we see that 3/4 of the immigrant population is now from Latin America or Asia, with a full half from Latin America, predominantly from Mexico. So, what about the health of these contemporary immigrants? Well, many Hispanic immigrants have low levels of education and earnings and limited English language skills. The rapid growth in the Hispanic immigrant population, combined with their low socioeconomic status, has aroused public health concerns about immigrant health problems and the demand for public assistance, such as Medicaid. So a lot of the rhetoric around immigrant health currently echoes the concerns expressed at the turn of last century with the previous great wave of immigration from Southern and Eastern European countries. So there are a lot of parallels between how the country is handling this current great wave of immigration and the previous great wave, and this extends into immigrant health. So in contemporary times, there's this idea that immigrant health problems, should they add disproportionately to the burden of disease in the population, would have potential negative implications for the nation's welfare and health insurance programs. And we'll talk about this a little bit later in the final section looking at immigrant health care. The fact of the matter is, however, that contrary to public concerns, over the past 30 years, a growing body of evidence indicates that immigrant health, and Hispanic immigrants' health in particular, where a lot of the fears are located, is actually superior to their native-born counterparts. I'm going to repeat that. Okay, so this is contrary to public concerns and a lot of the fear and contagion rhetoric that has shifted to the contemporary immigrant period. Contrary to that, a growing body of evidence indicates that immigrant health, and Hispanic immigrant health in particular, is superior to their native-born counterparts. In a national study of mortality, foreign-born persons, regardless of race and ethnicity, had overall a lower risk of death across nearly all ages and all causes of death compared to native-born adults. And we see that in this graphic here. Okay, this graphic looks at male life expectancy at birth by different race ethnic groups. Okay? And although the information that goes through 1994, so this is somewhat dated, but the patterns remain the same in more recent years. So let's look at the bottom two rows first. This is comparing the overall immigrant population to the U.S.-born population. Okay, and we see that immigrants have longer life expectancy than the U.S.-born population. This graphic is for males. On average, immigrant men live 3.5 years longer than U.S.-born men. Okay. So there is variation by country of origin, and that's what the other bars indicate on this graphic. So Black and Hispanic immigrant men and women had longer life expectancy than their U.S.-born counterparts. For Japanese, Chinese, and Filipino immigrants, they usually had life expectancy similar or slightly lower than their U.S.-born counterparts. And this next graphic shows the same for females. So if we look at the bottom two bars, we see that on average, female immigrants had 2.5 years longer life expectancy at birth than U.S.-born women. And we see the same race ethnic patterns as we did for men. So Black and Hispanic women had longer life expectancy than their U.S.-born counterparts, whereas Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino immigrants had the same or slightly lower life expectancy than their U.S.-born counterparts. So the main points here, the general pattern of health for contemporary immigrants, is that health, life expectancy, and mortality patterns for immigrants are generally better than the native-born, although it varies by region of origin group. Okay, so there are variations in nativity and country of birth patterns in life expectancy, morbidity, and cause-specific mortality. The real advantage, the real immigrant advantage, is most evident for Black and Hispanic immigrants. And that's where things get paradoxical. Okay, so this is referring to the epidemiological paradox. That's the term that has been coined to describe this pattern. Okay, that those immigrant groups, specifically Hispanic immigrants, with higher levels of socioeconomic disadvantage, are the immigrants who have better health outcomes than their native-born counterparts, and often health outcomes that are comparable to the health status of non-Hispanic whites who have higher levels of socioeconomic advantage. Okay, so it's precisely those immigrant groups with higher levels of disadvantage, socioeconomic disadvantage, basically Hispanic subgroups, who experience better health outcomes. Okay? And the epidemiological paradox can be framed in two ways. So better health outcomes than whom? Well, the two ways to frame the paradox are first to compare the health of immigrant groups, of the foreign-born, to native-born within particular race ethnic groups. So that would be comparing Hispanic immigrants to native-born U.S. Hispanics. Black immigrants to native-born African Americans. Okay? So you're comparing the health outcomes of an immigrant segment of a particular race ethnic group to the native-born segment of that group. And that's what we've talked about. That's what the previous slides shown. Another way to express the epidemiological paradox is to look at the health outcomes of particular race ethnic groups, for example, the Mexican origin population, and compare that to non-Hispanic whites. And so the difference is intra-group variation. That's what we just talked about when you're comparing within a race ethnic group the immigrant to the native-born population versus intergroup variation, or comparisons across race ethnic groups. We're looking at the health outcomes of the Mexican origin population in the U.S. compared to, for example, the non-Hispanic white or non-Hispanic Black population. And that's what this next series of slides does. So this is a series of slides that are coming from the Centers of Disease Control, the CDC, and it shows that for different health outcomes, the race ethnic comparisons across different race ethnic groups. And I want to highlight as we go through these slides the comparison between non-Hispanic whites and Hispanics. Okay? And remember, Hispanics have higher levels of socioeconomic disadvantage compared to non-Hispanic whites. Okay? They're much more comparable to African Americans in terms of their levels of socioeconomic disadvantage. But in terms of their health outcomes, we have this paradoxical pattern where their health outcomes are much more similar to non-Hispanic whites. So this first graphic looks at infant mortality. And we see that Hispanics have lower infant mortality than African Americans, and infant mortality rates that are comparable to non-Hispanic whites. This next graphic splits out the Hispanics into different region of origin subgroups. All right, so we have Mexican have an infant mortality rate of 5.5. Cubans have an infant mortality rate of 4.4. And Central and South Americans have an infant mortality rate of 4.7. Puerto Ricans have a higher infant mortality rate of 8.3, as do another category, which is a mix of all other Hispanic groups. But when we look at, for example, Mexican infant mortality rate of 5.5 is slightly lower than the infant mortality rate of non-Hispanic whites, which is 5.8. Okay? And Cubans and Central and South Americans have lower rates still. All of the Hispanic subgroups, including Puerto Ricans, have lower infant mortality rates than the African American population, which is exceedingly high at 13.3. Okay. So there is variability within the Hispanic immigrant population, with Mexican immigrants and Cuban and Central South American immigrants having populations. So this is not just immigrants, I should say. The comparison we're making here is all Mexican origin population, regardless of whether if they were foreign born or not, comparing to non-Hispanic whites. And those groups have infant mortality rates that are comparable or lower than non-Hispanic whites, much lower than African Americans. This next graphic looks at maternal mortality, and we see that Hispanics have lower maternal mortality than non-Hispanic whites. The maternal mortality rate is 8.2 for Hispanics. It's 9.6 for non-Hispanic whites. If we look at all-cause age-adjusted death rates per 100,000 persons by race ethnicity, we see that Hispanics have lower age-adjusted death rates than non-Hispanic whites and African Americans. So this is echoing some of these patterns that we've previously talked about, where the Hispanic race ethnic group has better health outcomes or comparable health outcomes to non-Hispanic white, in spite of much higher levels of socioeconomic disadvantage. If we look at motor vehicle-related injuries, they have levels that are lower than non-Hispanic whites, much lower than African Americans. This next graphic shows HIV death, age-adjusted death rates from HIV. Okay? And this is where the pattern turns a little bit. So we see that Hispanics actually have double death rates than compared to whites, although still much, much lower than African Americans. And we will see this in a second, that some of these patterns really do depend on what health outcome we're looking at. If we go to suicide, we get this positive epidemiological paradox pattern again, comparing Hispanics and whites. Hispanics have much lower rates of suicide, still slightly higher than African Americans. So this is the one health outcome where African Americans have exceedingly low age-adjusted death rates from suicide compared to the other race ethnic groups. And whites have the highest when we're comparing African Americans, Hispanics, and whites. What about homicide? So this is age-adjusted death rates per 100,000 persons for homicide, and we see that Hispanics have higher rates than non-Hispanic whites, but much lower rates than African Americans. So this is, again, where the pattern differs depending on the health outcome. So for HIV-related deaths, for suicide and homicide, we get a different pattern. Same for diabetes. They have higher levels of diabetes than non-Hispanic whites. This next graphic shows chronic liver disease and cirrhosis. Hispanics have higher levels than whites and African Americans. So this is one of the few outcomes, in addition to suicide, where Hispanics have higher levels than African Americans. For tuberculosis case rates, we see the same pattern where African Americans have the higher levels than non-Hispanic whites or Hispanics. So these are the comparisons that I'm making as we're going through these slides. You can see the other groups, Asian immigrants and Native Americans and Native Hawaiians, separately. But I'm really focusing on this comparison between non-Hispanic whites, non-Hispanic blacks, and Hispanics. Okay, so the take-home point from this set of slides is that there is variability depending on the health outcome that we're looking at. But overall, if we're looking at health outcomes such as overall age-adjusted death rates, infant mortality, maternal mortality, the general pattern is Hispanics have better health than we would expect given their socioeconomic profiles. They have health outcomes that are comparable or better than non-Hispanic whites, and usually much better than non-Hispanic blacks, although there are some exceptions. Okay, suicide being TB, diabetes being some of the more important ones. Okay, so what are the explanations for these paradoxical health patterns that we observe among the contemporary immigrant population? And remember, the paradox is set in the context of a public discourse that frequently focuses on the idea that immigrants, and Hispanic immigrants in particular, are presenting an undue burden on the U.S. healthcare system with poor health outcomes, echoing the fear and contagion narratives from the turn of the last century and the previous great wave of migration that we saw with Southern and Eastern European immigrants. Okay. So the paradox is that immigrants have better than expected health outcomes. Okay. Why? Well, the first explanation is the selection hypothesis. Okay. And this refers mostly to intra-group variation. Okay, so immigrants compared to native-born within a particular race ethnic group. So Hispanic immigrants compared to native-born Hispanics. And the selection hypothesis argues that the observed patterns of better immigrant health are the result of selective migration of healthier or more advantaged immigrants to the U.S. Okay, so this is the idea that only healthy people can migrate. So we have a healthy subset of the country of origin population. And so when they arrive to the U.S., of course they're going to look healthier because we're selecting out unhealthy people who are unable to migrate. Okay, so that's the selection hypothesis. Now, unfortunately, there's a lack of appropriate data that has precluded a conclusive test of this hypothesis. You really need data, comparable national level data from country of origin, country of destination, migrants who have not, non-migrants in the country of origin, migrants who are currently residing in the country of destination, and those who've returned. Okay? And no such data set exists. Okay? There has been attempts to parse out the selection hypothesis, and the general conclusion is that selection potentially plays a role with respect to certain health outcomes, with respect to the immigrant advantage that we see in certain health outcomes, but it's not enough to explain these patterns in their entirety. And we'll see that a little bit farther on. Okay, the second explanation for the epidemiological paradox is that it's a data artifact. And this is related to the selection hypothesis, but in the reverse. Okay, so this is the idea that immigrants selectively return migrate. So sick immigrants are more likely to return to their country of origin when they are sick and can no longer participate in the U.S. economy, resulting in artificially low recorded death rates for the immigrant population. So this particular argument is usually put forth with respect to the Mexican origin population. The idea that migrants from Mexico who are in the U.S. who get sick, they return to Mexico. So their deaths are not recorded in the U.S. vital statistics data, so we get these lower age-adjusted death rates for Mexicans. Okay, so really sick people go home. So for adult mortality, it's the return migration of sick in adults. For infant mortality, it's the return migration of women who have sick infants. So those infant deaths potentially are not recorded in the U.S. Okay, now there doesn't seem to be much evidence for this hypothesis. And this next graphic comes from an article that analyzed vital registration data for the period from 1995 to 2000 and really disputes this idea that the more positive infant mortality rates that we saw for the Mexican origin population as compared to non-Hispanic whites is a data artifact of the return migration of mothers with unhealthy infants. Okay, and this table, this data comes from the border region, and this is where we would expect the possibility to be most relevant, right? That women could return to Mexico with sick infants. And it shows, this is, if you look at the, on the left-hand side, we see these are infant mortality rate ratios, okay, by the age of the infant, starting from less than 1 hour after birth. Okay, and we see that for all the time periods after birth, from 1 hour all the way to a year after birth, immigrant women have lower infant mortality rate ratios than U.S.-born Mexican origin women. Okay, and the comparison is to non-Hispanic white women. So for every time period after birth, the immigrant women have lower infant death rate ratios. Okay. This next graphic comes from the same article, and they performed a simulation with their data and showed that immigrant women would have to have, for them to have the infant mortality rates that would, if the cause of their low infant mortality rates were totally due to data problems, i.e. the return migration of women with sick infants, so their infant deaths were not registered in the U.S., about 50,000 women with sick infants would have to out-migrate, return migrate to Mexico each year with all of those infant deaths occurring in Mexico to get the infant mortality rate that we do for the Mexican origin population in the U.S. So this is highly implausible that such a large fraction of the Mexican origin population is returning to Mexico with sick infants. So the authors conclude that the favorable mortality profiles, the infant mortality profiles is what this article is talking about, of the Mexican origin population are not due to selective outmigration among Mexican immigrants. Okay. So this particular analysis does not rule out the possibility of selection, but it does rule out the possibility that the low levels of infant mortality for the Mexican origin population are the result of a data artifact of the infant deaths not being registered in the U.S. Okay, the third explanation for the epidemiological paradox is called the cultural argument. This emphasizes the role of origin culture in lowering stress and fostering healthy behaviors through family cohesion and the provision of social support. So this is called the cultural argument, or the cultural hypothesis for the epidemiological paradox, emphasizing the role of origin culture in lowering stress and fostering healthy behaviors. And this is hypothesized to primarily occur through family cohesion and social support. So the idea is that foreign-born persons or immigrants who belong to race ethnic groups that have strong ties back to their homeland have positive cultural-based behaviors such as a healthy diet, low rates of substance abuse, and strong social supports. And that this in turn results in these better than expected health profiles given their levels of their higher levels of socioeconomic disadvantage. So it follows that immigrants are able to limit the harmful effects of their disadvantaged socioeconomic positions in the U.S. by relying on these cultural advantages. Okay, that's the hypothesis behind the cultural argument. So these patterns and the hypothesized role of lifestyle factors in determining the favorable health outcomes of the foreign-born and for particular race ethnic groups, if we're talking about variation, have called into question a strict socioeconomic approach to understanding differentials in health. So socioeconomic factors may not be as important in determining health risk in populations that are able to dampen or keep at bay the negative consequences attached to a disadvantaged social position through positive cultural practices. That's what the cultural argument argues.